So, as you've just been hearing this week, ministers, Michael Gove being one of them, unveiled a new definition of extremism under which certain groups will be blocked from government funding and meeting officials. It will apply to but not criminalise groups that promote an ideology based on violence, hatred and intolerance. However, some civil liberties advocates, plus community groups and MPs, have criticised this definition. Some people are saying, well, look, this definition of extremism could apply to both sides. I mean, could it mean that those people who perhaps were opposing things like vaccine passports, COVID measures, low traffic neighbourhoods, could they be categorised as extremists? And of course, you've got people on the other end of the debate, people who are perhaps groups that represent people of the Islamic faith. Some saying, well, look, we're not extremists. Why would some of our rhetoric be considered that way? Before we have a conversation about this, why don't we hear what Michael Gove had to say on this very subject?
As our new definition makes clear, extremism can lead to the radicalisation of individuals, deny people their full rights and opportunities, suppress freedom of expression, incite hatred, weaken social cohesion, and ultimately, it can lead to acts of terrorism. Most extremist materials and activities are not illegal and do not meet a terrorism or national security threshold. For example, Islamist and neo-Nazi groups in Britain are operating lawfully, but they advocate and work towards the replacement of democracy with an Islamist or Nazi society.
OK, well, just to give you that definition, extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to, number one, negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Number two, undermine, overturn, replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve the results in number one or number two, those two definitions previously. OK, let's now talk to Francesca Cosciani. She's a criminal defence lawyer at Hodge, Jones and Allen, and Ben Cope, political writer and commentator with Young Voices UK. I'll start with you, Francesca. Thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. So that definition of extremism seems reasonable, doesn't it?
Good morning. Well, the definition is extremely broad. It can include a range of speech and activity that is currently not necessarily against criminal law. It can be decided in an arbitrary way, depending on how it's interpreted. And arguably, one could say it's so broad that it could catch members of the Conservative Party themselves when trying to campaign to repeal parts of the European Convention on Human Rights. So there are concerns in terms of its definition as it stands. OK, Ben, what do you say to that? Does it perhaps, rather than going too far or not far enough, it's actually too broad and isn't specific enough?
So although I'd agree with some of those claims that it might still be too broad, I think we have to acknowledge where we've come from. The previous definition, which came about in 2011, I think was way broader than this. Anything that seemed to be fundamentally opposed to British values, a very difficult to define concept, was deemed to be extreme in the way that they described British values. Anything that was against the principle of mutual respect was counted as extreme. So I think this definition is clearly a lot tighter, and I think the Conservatives are due a lot of credit for doing that in a difficult political environment where, as we've seen with a lot of the protests that are going on at the moment, it would have been very easy for them to introduce something a lot more draconian, but instead they've shown restraint and I think introduced better policy here.
But the issue I have with it is a bit woolly. Negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. That is what a promotion or advancement of ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that negates or destroys the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. That is extremely subjective. And sometimes, for instance, I think when we've seen some of the protests in London on a week-by-week basis, where we've heard chants and where we've heard some intimidatory language, it's a little bit more clear-cut. But there are arguments, and I think this is where Francesca makes a fair point, that could say, well, there are members of the current government that would fall into that category. There are members of environmental groups that would fall into this category. I mean, if you are going to use intolerance or violence to negate the freedoms of others, well, half the net zero campaigners that we see on our streets are doing that. You know, things like Just Stop Oil, various other groups, Extinction Rebellion, as they were. So isn't this perhaps a little bit too woolly, Ben?
So I'd agree with a lot of that. I think particularly the reference to intolerance and then also creating a permissive environment. I think both of those are very subjective. But I think, I'd point to where we've come from, that this is a clear improvement in difficult circumstances. I think we only need to look to the kind of advice that the government was receiving on this. Sarah Khan, the independent advisor on these matters, on extremism, was pushing for something much more, extreme, in that anything that was deemed to be an out-group, an in-group perceiving something sort of about an out-group would be sort of anything sort of hateful in that regard would be deemed as extreme, and I think that would have been a much more troubling definition. So I think that they have shown restraint here when both their advisors and sort of political context might suggest that they might have gone even further.
I mean, Francesca, should they have gone further in trying to be more specific?
Well, I think, first of all, let's look at the purpose of this definition. At the moment, it's limited to what ministers and civil servants, to what groups they can receive funds from and to what groups they can communicate with. And of course, we don't want to live in a society that's dictated by extremism, but there can be nothing more un-British than telling British people what they can and cannot hear and what they should think as extremist or not extremist. I think there's a real risk in terms of how this could be adopted in the future. As it stands, it has no effect on criminal law, on protest law. And so one would question, well, what is the purpose of this at all? It's not like Conservative ministers are currently taking funds from some of the organisations they have mentioned would fall under the definition.
Then how do you solve a problem, though, with some of the extremist chants that we've heard in London, particularly when it comes to the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel action, those sorts of demonstrations? How do you police people feeling intimidated by some of those chants? How do you police people who are being intolerant of other people holding up placards that they disagree with and those sorts of things without some sort of definition like this?
The reality is that these are already being policed. The authorities have a plethora of criminal offences to address these issues, ranging from public order offences all the way to terrorism offences. And we have seen that these instances are being policed. They are being
sorry to interrupt you, but are they? I mean, because we've seen loads of people who seem to be getting away with this on a weekly basis, and they're not being policed.
I can certainly say from our part that there are people who have certainly been arrested and are being prosecuted for the chants that they have been chanting and the signs that they have been holding. Again, there is plenty of domestic legislation that covers these sorts of offences. The police is able to arrest individuals who they reasonably believe have broken the law.
So do you think then, Ben, picking up on Francesca's point, this is a failure of policing, perhaps, that is that this legislation, these definitions aren't needed because actually if the police were doing their job properly and using the existing laws to prosecute people and to find people and perhaps to pounce on them a little quicker during these demonstrations, actually these new definitions wouldn't be needed.
I would agree that the police already have existing powers in nearly all cases to intervene now where they should. You know, the government obviously passed their policing bill last year, so they're not really in a position to argue that the police don't have the powers that they think they should have. But as to whether these new rules are needed, I think we need to go back and look at the 2011 definition, which was, you know, again I say was much broader. So if we're saying that it is still too broad, then certainly these new rules were needed, given that the situation before was therefore much worse. As for how we can go forward maybe and improve them even further, I think moving them into law, as I think Francesca was alluding to, would be a good idea. I think at the moment it's too uncertain about how these new rules will actually be applied. You know, who decides who is extreme under these definitions or not. So I think the public would draw some confidence if there was actually a law that they could go and read and then it seems more of an official system.
Okay, well, Michael Gove in his speech this week also focused on, I think, something that most people would agree is an extreme ideology, and that's the ideology of Islamism. Let's hear what he had to say.
We've seen a terrible increase in anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hate crime, as well as a very significant increase in radicalisation. Troublingly, there is also evidence that some Islamists and extreme right-wing groups and others who seek to tear our society apart are working together to maximise the reach of their message and cause. And that is why the work of civil society organisations such as the Community Security Trust and Tel Mama, as well as Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, the educational charity Solutions Not Sides, and the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine is so important.
Okay, Francesca, do you think that those were reasonable comments by Michael Gove?
I think, again, we don't want to live in a society that's dictated by extremism, and we certainly want to ensure that people aren't led to dangerous ideologies that lead to violent attacks on other people. But again, introducing a broad definition to try and define that, I fail to see how that could address it.
Okay, Ben, what do you say to that?
So I generally agree with Michael Gove in that I think that has there has been a troubling rise in sort of some certain negative aspects of Islamism, and I think that's why it's right to have a sort of much more targeted definition. You know, I think the Conservatives coming under a lot of criticism for, you know, as a lot of people expect, that they might lose the next general election, that they might be laying a lot of booby traps and a bit of a scorched earth policy for Labour, trying to trip them up with some of the new rules or laws or taxes that they're committing to. So I think actually having, you know, some sensible policy here, you know, if anything, shows that they're committed to continuing to run the country well for as long as they are in charge.
All right, Francesca Cosciani, criminal defence lawyer at Hodge, Jones and Allen, and Ben Cope, political writer and commentator with Young Voices UK. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us this morning. What are your thoughts on this, Renee?
So I thought that was a really interesting debate, and I agree with Francesca that we have existing laws. The problem is that they are not being implemented. And it seems to me that not just on the extremism, but on anything we see, we're just putting a sticking plaster over a sticking plaster without addressing the fundamental issue, which is we've got plenty of legal power in this country. And for some reason, our police now feel impotent in actually exercising it.
I think the issue that has come to the surface in the last couple of weeks, few months, is Islamism.
Yes.
And I think that it's right that the government should be looking at doing something. The problem is that you're quite right, that what is there already is not being implemented. So rather than trying to get those things implemented, the government have said, oh, we'll come up with our own new definition. But the issue I have is it's almost a be careful what you wish for, because what will be used to therefore then rightly try and clamp down on Islamism, it's such a woolly definition that we will end up with a situation where, like I say, the next time, if there was ever a lockdown again and people wanted to protest against it, would that therefore end up being defined as extremism?
100%. And this is the problem. I mean, look, we need to look across our channel to European countries. I think France definitely, maybe Germany, Denmark, have actually banned from the river to the sea as a statement being made on their streets. Now, that's a very defined move, but it won't catch other things. It wouldn't catch someone protesting against the farming regulation, for example, because they're not going to use that saying. I thought it was really interesting that Ben said, well, you know, what we could have got was much worse, so it's good that we've got this. That's like saying, let me say as a doctor, look, I'm going to give you this treatment, Christo, and it's really not very good, but I could have done something worse.
Rather than being tighter, it should have been more specific, is what you're saying, and perhaps said, look, certain phrases and stuff. The problem is with the river to the sea, and again, this is not the debate I want to sort of crack open, but but the people I've debated that with have said, well, actually, no, but that's not offensive, because it's about, you know, it could be taken that it's about just actually Palestinian people also living among Jewish people. Some people will be saying it because they want to eradicate Jewish people. Some people will be saying it in a way that is not meant like that. Now, I don't know whether I agree with that fully, but you also have to take on board intent, don't you?
Well, I guess, you know, but intent is a judgment. How you intend
But how
something.
do you then legislate for that?
Well, exactly. So how you intend
But if you were to
something.
ban that phrase then, say we went down the road where we said,
phrase.
but then that's very specific, and there would be some people saying, well, look, what about freedom of speech?
OK, there are words that you and I are not allowed to say on air, aren't there, today?
Specific words about racial
words.
slurs,
Yes.
swear words, exactly.
They've been banned. Whether my intent would be good or bad, they are banned. And they
so
are
you
words that are used every day by some people.
But that also has existing legislation. I couldn't go up to someone. It would be a public order offence if I were to scream out some of those swear words in the street.
Well, if you use the N-word.
Yes.
Yeah. But black people use that word every day. Yeah.
But it's not criminalised but then therefore the intent is seen behind it.
We are not allowed to use that on air, whatever our intent was.
Yeah, I agree.